good evening, or good morning perhaps, or the quiet hours of a night has gone on longer than you planned, wherever you find yourself. I am glad you are here. My name is Aldworth. I am an apothecary. I have been at this counter for a very long time. Long enough to have accumulated opinions about most things. Long enough to know that the best conversations happen when no one is in a hurry. Tonight, we are going to spend some time with a plant, a common plant, one you have almost certainly walked past without stopping, one that has been walked past and then noticed and then found remarkable by an unbroken line of people stretching back further than recorded history. Tonight, we add ourselves to that line. It is a plant that smells of death and of desire simultaneously, that has been a bride's crown and a vampire's bane, a fairy portal and a Christian relic, a famine food and a cardiac drug, a witch's broomstick and a child's hedgerow snack, the oldest agricultural technology in Europe, and one of the most ancient archetypes in the human imagination. It is the hawthorn, the thorn of the boundary, and before this evening is over, I suspect you will never walk past it quite so easily again. If you find somewhere in the next few hours that this is the kind of company you would like to keep, there is a small thing you can do. A subscription costs nothing and tells whatever mechanism governs these things that the work is worth continuing. I am told there is also a bell for notifications. I understand very little about bells for notifications, but if it would bring you back, by all means, ring it. Now, then, step closer to the counter, if you would. Let us begin with the nerve. Let us begin with the nerve. Not the common name, the deep one. The one the language has carried since before anyone thought to write it down. Hage. Gorn. Old English. Two roots pressed together into a single word. Hag, meaning enclosure, meaning hedge, meaning boundary, and on which needs no translation. Hawthorn, the thorn of the boundary. Not named for its flower, though the flower is extraordinary. Not for its fruit, though the fruit has fed people through lean winters beyond counting. Named for where it stands. At the edge, at the line between one thing and another. Between field and field. Between farm and wild. Between the managed world and whatever lies beyond it. This is, as I have found, with many plants, not merely a linguistic accident. It is a description of what the plant actually is. The hawthorn belongs to the rose family. Rosaceae. This places it a distinguished company. Apples, pears, plums, and roses are its botanical cousins. Recognizable relatives, once you know, to look for the resemblance. The five-petaled flower, the way the fruit forms around a central core, the small persistent structures at the fruity's base. An apple tree and a hawthorn share a blueprint, though one grows to orchard timber and the other to impenetrable thicket. If you cut a haw in half and a small apple in half and hold them side by side, the family resemblance becomes unmistakable. The stone at the center of the haw corresponds exactly to the core of the apple. One is a fruit that built an industry. The other is what you find at the edge of the field that industry fenced. The genus name takes us back to ancient Greek, krategus, from kratos, meaning strength, and an anther, meaning sharp, strength and sharpness. The two qualities the scholars who named it considered most essential. They were not wrong. The hawthorn's wood is among the hardest produced by any native British tree. Dense enough to be used for tool handles, mallets, and engraving blocks. Dense enough to take a polish that approaches ivory. And the thorns. The thorns are formidable, but here is something worth knowing about them. They are not true thorns in the botanical sense. A true thorn is derived from modified leaf tissue. It can, in principle, be cleanly removed. The hawthorn's thorns are something different. They are modified short shoots, outgrowths of stem tissue itself. To remove one is not to snap it free. It is to tear the bark of the branch. The hawthorn does not merely carry its defenses, it is made of them. The strength and the sharpness are the same substance. The specific epithet, monogyna, is equally precise. One seed, from the Greek. Again, mono meaning single, gyna meaning, in botanical use, pistil. Each haw, each small, red fruit contains a single stone enclosed within it. This distinguishes Crataegus monogyna from its close relative Crataegus levigata, which typically bears two, a small difference, but the naming tradition can consider it definitive enough to anchor the species name. I say haw, and I should say what that is more precisely. The haw is classified as a pomme, not a berry, though it presents itself as one. The same fruit type as the apple, the same structure, much reduced in size, deep red in autumn, small enough to sit easily in the crease of a palm. Inside, that single stone, around the stone, dry, mealy flesh, not unpleasant. Not the eating of an apple, but recognizably the same kind of thing. Now, the common name that most people reach for first, May tree. The hawthorn is the only British plant named after the month in which it flowers. Every other flowering plant we name by color, or shape, or resemblance, or location. The hawthorn is named for when it arrives, for the specific annual event of its flowering. For the moment the hedgerow turns white and the countryside smells of something complicated. The May blossom, the May tree, the coming of May, and yet climate warming has complicated this. The hawthorn now frequently blooms in April. The name has become, in increasing numbers of years, a misnomer. The tree has not moved. The calendar has stayed fixed. Only the temperatures have shifted. The May tree blooms before May now, and the name tells you only what it used to be. There is something quietly unsettling in that. A plant named for its moment in time, arriving early, as though the hedgerow itself has grown impatient. The genus Crataegus is one of the most taxonomically complex in the entire plant kingdom, depending on who is counting and by what method. Valid species number anywhere from 150 to 1200. That is not a small disagreement. That is botanists looking at the same genus and arriving at figures that differ by a factor of 8. The reason is that hawthorns hybridize freely. They produce forms that are stable and distinct in one location. variable and blurred in another. The boundaries between species, like the boundaries the plant marks in the landscape, are not always clean. It is fitting, perhaps, that the boundary tree resists being categorized too firmly. Now I want to tell you about the flower, because the hawthorn flower is where the plant's character becomes most clearly strange. It is beautiful. 5 white petals, sometimes flushed with the faintest pink, clusters of them, held above the thorns in late spring. The hedgerow, in full hawthorn blossom, is one of the more remarkable sights available in the English countryside. Sheets of white against the green, a brief and generous extravagance. And then you lean in close, you smell it. The hawthorn flower produces a chemical called trimethylamine. Trimethylamine is one of the first volatile compounds released by decomposing animal flesh. It is the smell, or part of the smell, of decay, of something recently dead. It is also present in human sexual secretions. This is why the hawthorn blossom divides people so sharply. Some find it sweet and heavy and deeply pleasant. Others find it disturbing in a way they cannot quite name. Both responses are, chemically speaking, entirely accurate. The hawthorn does not produce this compound by accident. It produces it deliberately for a purpose. The hawthorn is not primarily pollinated by bees, as its appearance might suggest. It is pollinated to a significant degree by carrion insects, by beetles and bluebottles that seek rotting flesh. The flower mimics the smell of a carcass. It lures insects that are looking for death. It offers them pollen instead. This is a form of deception that the plant world practices in various ways. The hawthorn's version is particularly audacious. It does not merely attract. It mimics something the insect urgently wants to find. And so what looks like a spring celebration is, from the insect's perspective, a false alarm, the most beautiful thing in the hedgerow, and smells of death on purpose. People have always known the smell was troubling, even before anyone understood why. The old country prohibition on bringing hawthorn blossom indoors is found across England. Bad luck. They said, illness, death in the house. We tend to file such prohibitions under superstition and move on. But it is worth pausing here. The smell of decay, brought indoors into an enclosed space, is genuinely unsettling to the human nervous system. It triggers something old, something that was useful before we understood germ theory. The nose knows something the mind has not yet articulated. The prohibition, in this case, may have had a practical root that the folklore simply dressed in different language. And yet the same blossom has been woven into garlands since ancient times, carried at weddings, threaded into Ray-Day wreaths. The same compound that repels and disturbs also, in smaller doses, does something else entirely to the human nose. Something that explains the other half of what people report when they smell hawthorn. Life and death, both present in the same flower, sometimes in the same breath. The hawthorn has always held this double quality, has always refused to be entirely comfortable. Now, let me tell you about the young shoots. Because before the flower, before the thorn, there is the early spring growth. And the early spring growth has a name: bread and cheese. That is what country people called the young hawthorn leaves and flower buds, bread and cheese. Eaten raw as a hedgerow snack. One of the very first fresh green things available after a long winter. The leaves are tender at this stage. The buds are tight and slightly nutty in flavor. Not bread, not cheese. But something satisfying in the way that simple food eaten outdoors in early spring is satisfying. The name tells you what it meant to people who needed it. Not a delicacy, sustenance. The hedgerow offering what the larder had run low on. After months of stored and salted food, here was something fresh and alive available for the taking. The hedgerow as a larder. The hawthorn as the first thing it offered. A single mature hawthorn provides food or shelter for over 300 species of insects. 300 species from one tree. This gives the hawthorn one of the highest biodiversity values of any native European tree. Higher than the oak in some measures, higher than the ash. The thorns that make it impenetrable to larger animals make it perfectly safe for smaller ones. Birds nest deep in hawthorn thickets because nothing that wants to eat the eggs. The blossoms feed insects in spring. The haws feed birds and mammal in autumn. The bark and leaves support hundreds of moth and butterfly species through their larval stages. The hawthorn does not merely exist in its ecosystem. It sustains a significant portion of it. And the haws themselves, those small, dark red fruits of autumn, they are nutritionally remarkable, exceptionally high in flavonoids, oligomeric procyanidins, and vitamin C. The antioxidant activity of hawthorn flavonoids has been measured in some studies at more than 20 times that of vitamin C alone. 20 times. This is the fruit that children chew on their way home from school in October. This is the thing that country people called a haw and considered common and largely overlooked. The most ordinary fruit on the most ordinary hedge, and it carries one of the most concentrated antioxidant profiles in the temperate world. I find in my work that plants frequently arrange these surprises. The overlooked ones often turn out to be the most extraordinary. The hawthorn has been hiding this particular fact in plain sight for some time. Set the flower aside for a moment, if you would. What I want to tell you now requires a different kind of attention. Not the attention you give to something blooming in front of you. Something longer, something older. The hawthorn hedge is not a recent invention. Bronze Age field systems in Britain, systems dating back 3,000 to 4,000 years, show evidence of hedgerows. Almost certainly incorporating hawthorn, almost certainly looking in their essential structure, like what you would find at the edge of an English field today. 3,000 years of the same technology, the same plant, the same boundary. We tend to think of hedgerows as a feature of the medieval or early modern landscape. The hawthorn hedge predates the Norman conquest by 2,000 years and more. It may be the oldest continuously maintained agricultural technology in Europe. Not a tool that was abandoned and rediscovered, but one that has simply continued quietly from the Bronze Age to the present morning. But the hawthorn's relationship with human sacred sites is older still than its agricultural one, or perhaps they were never entirely separate. Throughout Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, stone circles and ancient burial mounds are frequently found with hawthorn trees growing at their entrances. This is not coincidence of soil type. Archaeobotanists who have studied these sites believe hawthorn was deliberately planted there, placed at the threshold, at the opening, the point where the ordinary world and the sacred one met. The boundary tree, planted at the most significant boundary its people knew. The association between hawthorn and the dead is equally ancient and equally widespread. Hawthorn has been recorded growing near megalithic tombs throughout the British Isles, not merely near, specifically at the entrances and approaches to burial chambers. These are structures built before writing, before recorded history in any form we can read. And already, the hawthorn is there, already standing at the threshold between the living and the dead. The association we find so richly documented in folklore and myth did not begin with the Celts or the Anglo-Saxons. It was already ancient by the time those cultures arrived to name it. Sardinia offers a striking confirmation of this pattern, the Tomba da Giganti. The giants' tombs, megalithic collective burial structures of considerable antiquity. And at these tombs, growing in the same way, for the same reasons, or reasons we can no longer fully recover, hawthorn trees. Sardinia and the British Isles are not near each other. Their prehistoric cultures were distinct. And yet both placed the hawthorn at the entrance to where they put their dead. The same tree, the same position, the same threshold, arrived at independently across the breadth of early European civilization. This is the kind of convergence that suggests the association was not invented by any single culture. It was noticed, observed in the plant itself, and then honored accordingly. The Druids placed hawthorn within the Ogham, the sacred Celtic alphabet, in which each letter was named for a tree. To be included in the Ogham was to be considered among the most spiritually significant plants known to that tradition. The hawthorn's letter is hwath, associated with difficulty, with boundaries, with the kind of strength that comes specifically from having endured. The Druids used hawthorn as a strengthening tonic in old age and weakness, not for the young and vigorous, for those who had lived long enough to need the specific support of something ancient and resilient. There is a kind of logic in that prescription, which I find worth sitting with. The oldest technology in the hedge, given to those in the oldest stage of life. We have established that hawthorn was present at sacred sites long before anyone recorded why. Now the records begin, and they are worth examining carefully. Dioscorides wrote in the 1st century of the Common Era. A Greek physician, the author of De Materia Medica, one of the most consequential medical texts ever produced. He documented the plant he called oxyacantha, the sharp thorn, our hawthorn. His description initiated a textual tradition of hawthorn medicine that continued largely unbroken into the 18th century. 1700 years of physicians reading what Dioscorides wrote and building upon it. That is a thread of transmission worth pausing on. Not because every physician who followed him was right, but because the thread itself tells you something. A plant that holds a place in the written medical tradition for 17 centuries has been doing something worth recording. Pliny the Elder followed. He recorded hawthorn in his natural history. Pliny was not a physician. He was a naturalist, a man of extraordinary range and considerable appetite for detail. His natural history is an attempt to catalogue the known world, all of it. That hawthorn earned its place in that catalogue, alongside its medical applications and its protective household uses, confirms the tree's status in Roman life. Not a fringe plant, not a regional curiosity. Something the most comprehensive natural history of the ancient world considered worth including. But it is Ovid who gives us the most vivid portrait of what the hawthorn meant to Rome. In the Fasti, his calendar of Roman religious festivals, Ovid records the story of Cardia. Cardia was the goddess of doorways, thresholds of the hinge between inside and outside. Janus, the god of beginnings, gave her the hawthorn as her sacred plant. And Ovid records her power in a phrase I find worth quoting exactly. Her power is to open what is shut, to shut what is open. The hawthorn was her instrument for this liminal work. The boundary tree, given to the guardian of boundaries, the logic is almost too clean. Cardia used hawthorn boughs to expel the strigers. The strigers were nocturnal creatures, vampiric spirits in Ovid's description, bird-like in form. They were believed to prey on sleeping infants, to drain the blood of the very young in the night. And the protection against them was hawthorn. Roman parents placed hawthorn branches in the cradles of newborn children, not as a gesture, as a genuine protective measure, as the substance that stood between the infant and what prowled in the dark. The thorns of the boundary placed around the most vulnerable threshold. A newborn child is precisely that, a threshold, a new life that has not yet fully arrived in the world. The Romans put hawthorn there because hawthorn belonged at thresholds. At the same time, Rome also put hawthorn at its most joyful ceremonies. The Roman wedding. Roman brides carried hawthorn torches in their wedding processions. Hawthorn blossoms were worn as bridal crowns. The god Hymen, deity of marriage and the wedding ceremony, carried a torch of hawthorn wood at celebrations. Birth and death, beginning and ending, the cradle and the marriage bed. The hawthorn present at all of them. It was not confused about its associations. It simply held all of them simultaneously. A plant that smelled of death and of desire, used at funerals and weddings alike. The Romans understood, perhaps intuitively, that these things were never entirely separate. The Greek mythological record had something darker still. The goddess Hera, in one strand of Greek myth, conceived Eris and Eris by touching a hawthorn blossom, without union with Zeus, without any partner. From a touch of hawthorn blossom alone, the gods of war and strife came into being. This is worth sitting with for a moment. The Greeks placed the origin of war and strife in the hawthorn flower, not in a weapon, not in ambition or greed in a blossom, in the white flower of the May tree with its complicated smell. There is a theology embedded here that I find more honest than it might first appear. War and strife do not always begin with obvious causes. Sometimes they begin with something that seemed beautiful, something touched carelessly. The hawthorn blossom that gives rise to gods of conflict, in a myth told by people who had seen what conflict does. We should cross an ocean now, or rather cross a continent, because while the Greeks and Romans were building their relationship with the European hawthorn, Something equally careful was happening in China. Crataegus pinnatifida, Xianja, the Chinese hawthorn, a different species from our own, but the same genus, the same family of properties, the same red berry in autumn. In 659 AD, the Tang dynasty produced a document of extraordinary importance, the Tang Ben Cao, the Tang Materia Medica, the world's first state-commissioned pharmacopoeia, a formal, official record of medicinal plants produced under imperial authority. And in that record, the hawthorn berry, among the earliest officially documented medicinal plants in human history. The Chinese did not arrive at hawthorn by accident or by mythology alone. They arrived at it through observation, through the same careful attention to what worked that produced the Tang Ben Cao itself. Traditional Chinese medicine classified the hawthorn berry as entering the liver, spleen, and stomach meridians. It was understood to stimulate digestive enzymes, to break down meat and fats in particular. This is an independent discovery, made entirely separately from anything the Greek or Roman, or later European tradition developed. And it identifies properties that European medicine, for all its hawthorn tradition, largely overlooked for centuries. The US focused on the heart, on circulation, on the cardiovascular properties we will come to in time. The East focused on digestion, on the liver and stomach, on a different system entirely. Two civilizations looking at the same berry, asking different questions of it, and both finding useful answers. The Tang Ben Cao entry was not merely academic. The hawthorn berry in China became a thing of daily life, of popular culture. Consider the Bingtang hulu, candied haws on a stick, hawthorn berries skewered on a wooden spike, dipped in hard sugar syrup, sold in the streets of northern Chinese cities. A street food. One of the most beloved sweet snacks in Chinese popular culture, eaten for centuries. Children buying them from vendors, the red berries bright under the sugar glaze. The medicinal berry of the Tang pharmacopoeia, sold on a stick at the roadside. I find this one of the more charming facts in the entire hawthorn record. The boundary between medicine and pleasure in the Chinese hawthorn tradition was always comfortably blurred. You ate it because it was delicious. You also ate it because it helped your digestion after a large meal. The distinction was not one the tradition felt it necessary to draw. We have followed the hawthorn through Greece and Rome and the courts of the Tang dynasty. Now I want to take you somewhere older in a different sense. Not older in calendar years necessarily. Older in the way that what is spoken around fires at night is older than what is written in daylight. In Ireland, the hawthorn is called the sietch giel, the bright thorn, the shining thorn, and it is revered above all other trees as the fairy tree. Not merely associated with fairy tradition, not merely present in it, revered above all others for this purpose. The solitary hawthorns that stand alone in Irish fields, not part of a hedge, not grouped with other trees, but standing alone in open ground. These are understood to be inhabited by the Aos giant, the supernatural race descended from the pre-Christian deities of Ireland. Not ghosts, not metaphors. The actual former gods of the land, diminished in standing but not in power, living beneath and within these trees. The reverence was deep enough to shape language itself. In many parts of rural Ireland, people did not speak the fairy association of the tree directly. They called it the lone bush, the gentle bush. Gentle, in this context, means something closer to its older meaning, of the gentry, of those above ordinary human station. A linguistic taboo, a way of acknowledging what stood in the field without addressing it too directly. The belief that naming a thing carelessly might attract its attention has deep roots in human culture. The Irish avoided the fairy name for the hawthorn the same way other traditions avoid speaking with the name of what they fear. The AOSI, in this tradition, planted hawthorns at the entrances to their underground dwelling places. The Sudi, the fairy mounds of Ireland, the hills and earthworks beneath which the old powers were said to live. Hawthorns placed at the entrances, thorned guardians between their realm and the mortal world above. We return again to the threshold. The hawthorn at the entrance, as it stood at megalithic tombs, as Cardia used it at doorways, as the Bronze Age farmers planted it at the edges of fields. Always the same position, always the boundary, always the point where one world meets another. The consequences of disturbing a fairy thorn were understood to be severe. Cutting a lone hawthorn brought ruin, brought illness, brought death to the household that committed the act. This was not a belief that faded with modernity in Ireland as quickly as one might expect. In the 20th century, construction projects were rerouted to avoid disturbing fairy thorns. Roads bent around them. Building plans redrawn. Engineers and planners working in a modern industrial economy, accommodating the requirements of a belief older than any structure they were building. I noted this same pattern with Elder, that superstition sometimes functions as conservation. The ancient hawthorns that survived the rationalization of the English landscape survived because farmers feared to cut them. The fear was the protection. Mythology was the mechanism. Thomas, the rhymer, is perhaps the most vivid account in the British tradition of what proximity to a fairy hawthorn might mean. He was a 13th century Scottish mystic, a real person, recorded in historical sources as well as legend. He encountered the Queen of Fairy beside a hawthorn bush. A cuckoo was calling from it. She led him into the other world. When he returned, 7 years had passed. This motif, time moving differently on the other side of the fairy threshold, is one of the most persistent in Celtic tradition. And the hawthorn is consistently where the crossing happens. Not a door, not an archway. A tree, a specific, recognizable, common tree that anyone might pass without knowing what stood beside it. To fall asleep beneath a hawthorn at Beltane or midsummer was considered an invitation. Not a safe one. Sleepers were said to be carried to the other world. Some never returned. Some returned aged beyond recognition. Some returned with gifts, with prophecy, with a knowledge they had not possessed before. The risk and the possibility were the same act, the same sleep, under the same tree. On the Isle of Man, the belief was differently weighted, falling asleep under hawthorn. On Beltane Eve might grant you a wish. The same tree, the same night, a different tradition within a single cultural region. Ruin on one island, a granted wish on another. This inconsistency is not a weakness in the folklore. It is a feature of it. The fairy tradition does not promise predictable outcomes. It promises powerful ones. The hawthorn is the place where powerful things happen. What kind of powerful is not guaranteed? May Day brought its own hawthorn customs, gentler ones, mostly. Young women who rose at dawn on May Day and washed their faces in dew collected from hawthorn blossoms were promised beauty for the year. This was among the most widely practiced folk customs in the British Isles, persisting, recorded accounts tell us, into the 18th century. Not a fringe belief, a common one, a thing that women did quietly at first light, walking to the nearest hawthorn in the early morning, gathering the dew from the blossoms before the sun could warm it. The dew specifically, not the flower, not the leaf, the water that had rested on the blossom through the night. Water that had touched the fairy tree in the hours when the boundary between worlds was thinnest. The children's rhyme we still sing holds its own hawthorn secret. Here we go. Gathering nuts in May. There are no nuts in May. Nothing is nutting in May in the English countryside. Nuts in May is a corruption of knots of May, knotted hawthorn boughs, gathered on May Day morning to decorate homes, maypoles, and bridal beds. A May Day custom so embedded that a rhyme about it is still taught to children who no longer know what nuts in May means, or that it was ever anything other than nonsense. The hawthorn is there, encoded in the song, waiting to be noticed, as it has always waited patient, thorned at the boundary between what is remembered and what has been forgotten. The hedge itself carries a word we have half forgotten the meaning of: hedge, witch. The term does not derive from the idea of a witch who tends a garden hedge. It derives from the hawthorn hedge as a boundary between worlds. The hedge path was the path walked by those who moved between this world and the next, 1 foot in each realm. The hawthorn on either side. The hedge witch was not a witch of gardens or of domesticity. She was a walker of boundaries, someone who could pass through the hawthorn threshold and return with what she found there. The word for what she was is embedded in the name of the tree she walked beside. Wales gives us some of the most extraordinary hawthorn mythology in the British tradition. Consider the giant Ysbyddaden Pencor, his name translates. In full as chief of giants, Hawthorn. He is the father of Olwen in Mabinogion tale of Culture Olwen. Olwen's name means she of the white track. White trefoil flowers spring up in her footprints wherever she walks. The daughter of Hawthorn, leaving white blossoms in her path. The imagery maps precisely onto the plant. The thorn giant, the white flowering daughter. The story encodes the hawthorn's double nature in its central characters, the formidable father, the beautiful child. Then there is Blodeuwedd, created from flowers by the wizards Math and Gwydion as a bride for the hero Lulor Giffers, conjured partly from hawthorn blossom, from the white flower of the May tree. She is described as the most beautiful woman in the world, and she betrays her husband absolutely. She takes a lover. She conspires in Lu's murder. She is transformed in punishment into an owl. The creature that hunts in the dark, that turns its face from the light. The flower, made flesh, turned against the man she was made to love. Irresistible desire and deadly betrayal, both emerging from the hawthorn blossom. The Welsh mythographers were telling the same story, the Greek myth of Hera told, through different characters, in different language. Beauty from the Mayflower, destruction not far behind it. And then Merlin, the most powerful wizard in the British mythological tradition, and he ends inside a hawthorn tree. Nimue wound her veil around him as he slept beneath the thorn the enchantment held. He did not die. He could not die. But he could not leave either. Imprisoned forever within the hawthorn, his voice, some versions say, still audible in the rustling of hawthorn, leaves on a still day. The greatest of wizards, contained by a tree. This is not a diminishment in the mythology. It is a recognition. The hawthorn was considered powerful enough to hold Merlin. That is not a small thing to say about a tree. The Germanic tradition took the hawthorn in a different direction entirely. In Teutonic belief, hawthorn wood was burned on funeral pyres, not as any available fuel, specifically, deliberately, to help carry the soul heavenward on the smoke. Guardian of birth in the Celtic world, escort of the dead in the Germanic one. The same tree, on either side of the same sea, performing opposite roles at the same threshold. Life's beginning and life's ending. The hawthorn present at both. Walpurgis Night, the eve of the 1st of May, inverted the May Day celebrations into something darker. Hexenacht, Witches' Night. The broomsticks that witches were said to ride on this night were fashioned in the tradition from hawthorn wood. The same tree that decorated the maypole and the bridal bed. The same wood that bore the May Day garlands. On the night before May Day, it became the vehicle of the witch's flight. The joyous and the uncanny, separated only by a single sunset, the hawthorn serving both. The Brothers Grimm encoded the hawthorn in a story most people have known since childhood without knowing it. Sleeping Beauty, the impenetrable thorn hedge that grows around the sleeping princess, growing higher and deeper over the 100 years of her enchanted sleep. Scholars of myth have read this as hawthorn allegory for a very long time. The thorned boundary enclosing dormant life. The prince who parts the hedge, her awakening. The sexuality and the danger and the beauty all present in the same impenetrable thicket. The hawthorn, once you know to look for it, is visible on every page of that story. I want to end this section with something simpler, something from daily life rather than mythology. An old Irish expression, not a myth, not a legend, something a person said when conditions were bad and getting worse. When all fruit fails, welcome whores. This was not a poetic sentiment. It was a subsistence reality. When the harvest failed and the stores ran low, the hawthorn hedge remained. The halls still hung on the branches, still available, still nourishing in their mealy, unremarkable way. The last line of survival. The boundary tree at the boundary of survival itself. All the mythology and all the magic attached to this tree is built on top of that simple fact. The hawthorn was there when everything else was gone. And people remembered that the fairy reverence, the Walpurgis Night terror, the Blodad myth, the Sleeping Beauty hedge, all of it rooted, at least partly, in a tree that fed people when nothing else would. We have met Cardia already, but she deserves a moment of fuller attention. Her domain was not merely doorways in the architectural sense. It encompassed the body's vital thresholds of the passages of birth and death. The moment a child enters the world, the moment a person leaves it. These were hers, and the hawthorn was her emblem and her weapon in guarding them. A goddess whose entire purpose was the threshold, given a tree whose entire identity is the boundary. The Romans were not being casual when they made this association. In Celtic tradition, hawthorn belongs to Brigid, goddess of spring, of creativity, of healing, and of the flame that warms without consuming. The May blossom was considered one of her gifts to the land, her annual announcement that the cold season had ended. When the hawthorn flowered, Brigid had returned to the landscape. The two associations, Cardia and Brigid, tell you something about how wide the hawthorn's divine range was. In Rome, it guarded against darkness. In Celtic tradition, it announced light, protector, and herald, weapon, and gift. The same tree, in different hands, performing different sacred work. In Welsh and English traditions, the hawthorn in full blossom is called the Lady of the May. Not merely a tree that blooms in May, a personification, a goddess made visible in white flowers. The spirit of spring itself, given a body of bark and thorn and blossom, walking the hedgerows in late April, and May announcing herself in the only language available to her. The scent, the white, the sudden abundance of flowering after the long grey months. To see a hawthorn in full blossom was, in this tradition, to see the divine made present. Not a symbol of spring, spring itself, briefly visible. Now, a convergence I find remarkable. Cardia, the Roman goddess, used hawthorn to repel malevolent forces at doorways. The AOS of Celtic Ireland placed hawthorn at the entrances to their underground dwellings as thorned guardians. These two traditions did not know each other. Latin and Celtic cultures diverged long before either recorded these beliefs. And yet, both arrived at the identical understanding: hawthorn at the threshold. Hawthorn as the guardian against what should not pass. This suggests something older than either tradition. A common root belief carried from a shared cultural ancestor before Latin and Celtic separated into distinct peoples. An Indo-European understanding of the hawthorn as threshold guardian, old enough to have survived the divergence of two major civilizations intact. What exactly that original belief was, we cannot recover, but its fingerprints are on both traditions. The AOS Sisu used hawthorn trees not only as doorways, but as gathering places, council chambers in the Irish tradition, meeting places for the supernatural community, and the paths between their various dwelling places, the fairy paths, were marked by hawthorn trees at intervals. To move a hawthorn that stood on a fairy path was to interrupt a procession. To place yourself uninvited between the AOSD and where they were going. The consequences were understood to be catastrophic. Not merely unlucky, catastrophic. An entire invisible infrastructure of movement and assembly, mapped onto the hawthorns of the Irish countryside. Every lone hawthorn potentially, a waypoint on a route no human eye could trace. Biddy, Early lived in County Clare from around 1798 to 1874. She was a wise woman, a healer, someone to whom people came when conventional remedies had failed. She was also, by her own account, someone who had been given gifts he had not sought. She attributed part of her second sight to sleeping beneath hawthorn trees. The tree, she believed, opened her to communication with the spirit world, with her own dead brother specifically. This is a very particular and personal version of the fairy thorn tradition, not the vast supernatural machinery of the AOSSI, not the cosmic threshold of Cardia. One woman, one tree, the voice of someone she had lost, available again beneath the thorn. The hawthorn as a place where dead remain audible to those willing to listen for them. Biddy Early is a historical figure. Her reputation was substantial enough to survive in documented records. She was not reporting mythology. She was reporting her own experience. I offer that without commentary. It seems to me to deserve to be offered without commentary. There is a thing worth knowing about how Beltane is observed by those who take it most seriously today. Celtic reconstructionists do not celebrate the festival on the 1st of May. They celebrate it when the local hawthorn trees, not the calendar, the tree, the festival anchored to the plant's living phenology rather than to an abstract date on a page. This means Beltane arrives at a different moment each year in each place, as the hawthorn decides. The tree sets the festival, not the other way around. I find something deeply sensible in this, and something that most of our relationship with time has abandoned. On May Eve, in the Irish and Scottish tradition, a hawthorn branch was brought into the home. The May bush, decorated with ribbons, with flowers, with shells, placed at the threshold of the household. Not set on a table or placed in a corner, at the threshold specifically. The same position the plant occupies in the landscape, the same position Cardia assigned it, the same position the AOST marked with it. The May bush drew on the tree's fertility energy into the household through the one opening in the house that mattered most. The door, the boundary between inside and outside, a threshold. Young women kept sprigs of hawthorn blossom close to the bodies at Beltane, a charm to attract a husband. The same flower that smells of death and desire, worn against the skin as an invitation. The trimethylamine doing its work, perhaps, at closer range than the carrier knew. Or perhaps the charm was working entirely as intended. On May Eve itself, in the British tradition, something older and less easily categorized was taking place. Villagers went into the woods on the night of April the 30th. They returned at dawn bearing hawthorn blossom. This custom is recorded with various degrees of comfort by later historians. Because what happened in the dark woods on May Eve was not entirely about gathering flowers. The hawthorn blossom carried out of the night was an emblem of what had transpired in the hours of darkness. The flower of desire, in its season, gathered in the manner that suited him. The May blossom, brought home at dawn, was both a proof and the celebration of the night. A very old custom, very honestly encoded in what the gatherers chose to carry home. The maypole itself carried the symbolism into daylight and into public ceremony. The pole planted into the earth The ribbons wound around it by the dancers. And at the top, a wreath of hawthorn blossom. The May tree's fertile white flowers, crowning the phallic pole at the center of the village green. The ritual's symbolism, as one commentator noted, was entirely unmistakable. It was not subtle. It was not intended to be subtle. The hawthorn blossom was present precisely because its associations were understood by everyone in the circle. May Queen, who wore a garland of hawthorn, was wearing those associations on her head. On Beltane morning itself, the mood shifted toward something more protective. Yellow and white flowers, prominently hawthorn, were placed at doorways and at the entrances to byres across 19th century Ireland. The byre being where the cattle were kept, the livestock that represented the household's wealth and survival, welcoming summer in through one symbolic act, and warding off fairy mischief through the same one. Because Beltane was a time of thin boundaries, a time when the AOS Sadim moved more freely than usual. The hawthorn at the door was both a celebration and a defense, both an opening and a closing. Her power is to open what is shut, to shut what is open. Cardia's phrase again. The same quality, expressed in a different culture, in a different century. At Clutie Wells, across Ireland and Scotland, hawthorn trees stood over the water. Clutie Well is a holy well, a spring with healing associations, usually very old. People came to these wells with strips of cloth, rags, sometimes something more carefully chosen. They tied the cloth to the branches of the hawthorn standing over the water. Each strip an offering, an exchange proposed. The rag tied to the branch would rot away as the illness was cured. The tree taking on the affliction, the water, the tree, and the supplicant in a three-way negotiation. These wells were visited in every century, for which we have records. Some are still visited now. The hawthorn branches still hung with cloth in various stages of decay. A continuous tradition, older than Christianity in these islands, younger than it has any right to be. And beneath hawthorn trees, the hand fasting, the Celtic trial marriage, a vow made for a year and a day, renewable or dissolved at its term. The ceremony held beneath a hawthorn bower. The white blossom overhead as a canopy, the fairy powers invoked as witnesses to what was promised. Not a church, not a priest, a tree and the powers understood to inhabit it as the authority before whom the vow was made. The couple, standing at the threshold of their trial year, beneath the boundary tree, beginning something uncertain, beneath a tree that has always stood at the edge of certainty. There is a rightness to that choice that does not require mythology to appreciate. The medieval physicians inherited a hawthorn tradition already 2,000 years old. Dioscorides in the 1st century, Pliny shortly after, and then across the medieval period, practitioners building on what those earlier writers had established, adding observations, refining applications, finding new conditions the plant addressed. What they found first was not the heart. That came later. Medieval European physicians reached for hawthorn, initially for gastric complaints, for swelling, for throat, inflammation, and bronchitis, The digestive utility was recognized before the cardiac one. This is worth noting. The plant the modern world associates almost entirely with heart medicine spent its medieval career mostly in the stomach and the throat. The cardiac applications that we now consider central were arrived at gradually through accumulation of observation, not through a single discovery, but through the slow drift of attention toward what the plant was most consistently doing. Paracelsus recorded hawthorn's beneficial effects on the heart in the early 16th century. He was Swiss, a physician, alchemist, and controversialist who overturned much of what had come before him. His cardiac observation placed him in a chain of documentation stretching from Dioscorides to his own era. 15 centuries of hawthorn medicine, each generation adding something to what the previous one had established. Paracelsus was not the first to notice the heart connection, but he was among the first to record it with the seriousness his reputation carried. After Paracelsus, the cardiac tradition accelerated. But let us pause here in the medieval period and attend to something that belongs specifically to it. Something that happened on a hill in Somerset. The Glastonbury thorn, Crataegus monogyna, but a particular variety, mutant form, biflora, that flowers twice each year, once in spring with all other hawthorns, and once at Christmas, in the dead of winter, when nothing else flowers, when the English landscape is bare and grey. This double flowering was mentioned in medieval texts as a miraculous phenomenon. It attracted pilgrims for centuries. People travelling to Glastonbury, specifically to see a hawthorn tree bloom in December. The legend attached to it is one of the more audacious in British Christian mythology. Joseph of Arimathea arrived in Somerset, bearing in the legend the Holy Grail. He and his companions climbed Wiriel Hill. His staff was of hawthorn wood. He thrust it into the... It took root. It flowered. At Christmas, as a sign of divine approval for the mission that had brought him there, the hawthorn staff becoming a hawthorn tree, the instrument of the journey becoming a permanent marker of arrival. Medieval interpreters read the double flowering as a theological statement. The spring flowering aligned with Beltane, with the ancient pagan calendar. The winter flowering aligned with Christmas, with the Christian sacred calendar. One tree, both flowering moments, the pagan and the Christian sacred year reconciled in a single plant. Miraculous botanical embodiment of the Christianization of Britain. The hawthorn, which had stood at the entrance to megalithic tombs before Christianity arrived, now flowering at Christmas to welcome it. Whether you find this theologically convincing is your own affair. What I find remarkable is the cultural work the tree was being asked to do, to hold the old world and the new one simultaneously in its twice yearly flowering. The custom of sending a Christmas sprig to the English monarch began in the early 17th century. A branch of the Glastonbury thorn sent to Queen Anne. It has continued various interruptions ever since. The crown and the oldest British tree mythology connected each December by a cutting of hawthorn, the boundary tree, at the boundary of the year. The Reformation was not kind to the original Glastonbury thorn. Puritan iconoclasts cut it down deliberately, an object of superstitious veneration in their framing, a thing that drew pilgrims away from proper worship. The hawthorn, which had survived every other assault on its mythology across 2,000 years of Christianity, did not survive the Reformation's particular intensity. But local people had taken cuttings, as they had always preserved what mattered, as the hawthorn had always persisted by beginning again rather than by living forever. Descendants of the original tree grow at Glastonbury Abbey today, still flowering twice a year, still sending their Christmas cutting to the monarch. The cutting destroyed, the root surviving, the tradition continuing. William Blake knew the legend. His Jerusalem draws on the older story behind it, that Christ himself may have visited Glastonbury with Joseph before the staff was planted, before the first Christian church in Britain was built on that ground. And did those feet, in ancient time, walk upon England's mountains green? The question posed by the most famous hymn in English, rooted in a story about a hawthorn tree on a Somerset hill. Now, I must tell you about the plague, because the Great Plague changed the hawthorn's relationship with the English imagination in a way that had not happened before. Hawthorn blossom, as we have established, produces trimethylamine, the compound associated with decomposition. With the first stages of decay, in ordinary times, this smell was troubling to some, exciting to others, complicated for most. During the plague years, it became something else entirely. The smell of hawthorn blossom became specifically associated in popular imagination with the deathbed, with the particular smell of a room in which someone was dying or had recently died. People began to fear the blossom in a way they had not before. Not the fairy fear, which was ancient and in some ways comfortable in its familiarity. A new fear that the scent itself carried contagion, that the flower was not merely a symbol of death, but a vector of it. The old prohibition on bringing hawthorn blossom indoors acquired a new and more urgent meaning. What had been a fairy taboo became, during the plague years, something closer to quarantine instinct. The nose knowing something, the mind had not yet articulated as it had always known it. Only now, in those years of mass death, what the nose was responding to felt immediate and present, rather than symbolic. Cormac Macquillan, in recorded observations of Beltane in 900 AD, the scholar king of Munster. His writing constitutes one of the earliest written Irish references to hawthorn's role in seasonal ritual. Between Cormac's record and the plague years, between 900 and the 17th century, the hawthorn accumulated meaning without interruption. Each era adding to it, each crisis and each celebration leaving its mark on what the tree meant. By the time the plague had passed, the hawthorn carried the weight of everything. The Glastonbury miracle, and the fairy terror, and the bridal garland, and the deathbed smell. All of it present simultaneously, all of it available to anyone who walked past a flowering hedge in May. The most complex, emotional, and spiritual biography of any plant in the English tradition, encoded in a hedge so common that most people pass it without a second thought. I want to return for a moment to a word, hag. We use it now as an insult. An old woman, unpleasant, perhaps malevolent. But the word is much older than the insult, And the older meaning is more interesting. Hag derives from the Old English heg, meaning the same root that gives us hawthorn, the same root that gives us the concept of the boundary itself. The hag was she who walked the hedge, the woman of the boundary, the one who moved between this world and whatever lay beyond the hawthorn's edge. The witch archetype in English, rooted etymologically in the hawthorn hedge, not a corruption of the word, the original meaning preserved in plain sight. And hedge witch walked her hedge in both directions. Hawthorn protected the house. This we have established thoroughly. Sprigs placed at doorways and windows, the thorns blocking physical and magical passage alike. The sacred hedgerow incorporating hawthorn, blackthorn, elder, and holly understood as a complete magical barrier. Protection against evil, against storm, against lightning. Laying and maintaining such a hedge was a spiritual practice as much as an agricultural one. The farmer who tended his hawthorn hedge was doing more than managing livestock boundaries. He was maintaining the protective structure of his world. But the same hawthorn that protected the household was also ridden by those who walked between worlds. The preferred wood for witches' broomsticks in European folk belief was hawthorn, the wood of the hedge, the wood of the boundary. The tool of the woman who rode it was made from the same substance as the barrier she crossed. This is not a contradiction in the tradition, it is precision. Only the material of the boundary can be used to transgress it. You cannot cross the hedge with just any wood, you cross it with hawthorn. The witch bottle is one of the more practically minded pieces of folk magic in the British tradition. A sealed vessel containing pins, nails, hair, urine, and hawthorn thorns, buried at the threshold of the household, at the point of entry. Its purpose was to trap and redirect curses, directed at those who lived within. The curse crossing the threshold, entering the bottle, and being turned back on whoever had sent it. Witch bottles have been found during building works throughout England, buried exactly where the tradition describes, under hearths, under doorsteps, at the corners of foundations, real objects, preserved underground for centuries, the hawthorn thorns still present within them. Not metaphor, not merely recorded practice, physical evidence dug from the ground. The same thorns were used offensively. Hawthorn, thorns driven into a wax figure, appear in British witch trial records of the 17th century. A method of causing harm at a distance, the poppet as a substitute for the body of the target. The thorn that pierces the wax are understood to pierce the person it represents. The same thorn, the same tree. In the witch bottle, a defense against curses. In the poppet, the instrument of one. Protection and transgression. The two uses separated only by intention. This is the hawthorn's quality again. The same substance serving opposite purposes depending on how it is approached. In Scotland, hawthorn wood was carved into wands and magical implements. The runic symbol for thorn inscribed upon them. Therisas in the Norse system, a symbol associated simultaneously with defense and with dangerous force. The same ambiguity encoded in the rune as in the tree it described. The thorn that protects is the same thorn that wounds. The Scots carved this truth into the implement itself, into the wood, into the letter. Hawthorn flowers were used in potions to grant second sight, the ability to see what is ordinarily invisible, fairies, spirits, the movements of the other world. The blossom's liminal quality, understood as actively opening the practitioner's perception. The scent of death and desire, the trimethylamine that troubles the human nose with its ambiguity, doing something similar to ordinary perception, disrupting the boundary between what is seen and what is not. Biddy early sleeping beneath the hawthorn. The second sight that came to her there, the blossom potions of the folk tradition and the tree sleeping of the wise woman are describing the same mechanism. The hawthorn at the threshold of perception as it stands at every other threshold. In Brittany and Wales, Clwtywel tradition took a specific form. Strips of red fabric tied to hawthorn boughs, red specifically. The color of blood, of life, of what was at stake in the offering. The supplicant's illness expected to rot away as the cloth decayed. The tree taking on what the body needed to release. This is a very old mechanism. The transfer of affliction to a material object, which then decays while the person heals. The hawthorn chosen as the receiver of this transfer because it stood at the boundary where such exchanges were possible. And then there is hoodoo, the American folk magic tradition, blending African, Native American, and European influences in the communities of the American South. In hoodoo, hawthorn berries appear in protective magic focused on the hearth and home. The same application that Cardia embodied in Rome. There's a guardian of the household threshold, separated from its Roman origin by 15 centuries in an ocean, arriving in the American tradition through the European folk knowledge that accompanied the settlers, and finding its way into a new syncretic tradition that had no direct knowledge of Cardia or the Striges or the infant's cradle in Rome, but recognized the hawthorn berry's protective quality at the threshold of the home as something worth incorporating, as something that worked. The hawthorn's magical tradition spans 3 continents and 2,000 years of recorded practice. It is simultaneously the protector of the household and the wood that crosses the boundary, the material of the hedge and the tool of the hedge walker, the thorn in the witch bottle and the thorn in the poppet, the blossom that opens second sight and the blossom that was feared during the plague. Protection and transgression, life and death, the same tree, the same thorns, the same white flowers, serving every purpose, refusing none of them. The boundary tree that has never belonged entirely to either side of the boundary. We have followed the hawthorn as a guardian of thresholds from the megalithic tombs of prehistoric Europe to the Clwtywels of Celtic tradition. Now I want to take you east to the Balkans, to a tradition that took the threshold guardian concept with complete seriousness. In Serbian folk belief, the vampire is a very specific problem, not the elegant literary creature of later centuries, a corpse that has not stayed dead, that has returned across the threshold. It should have crossed only once. The preferred instrument for dealing with such a problem was hawthorn. Glog, in Serbian, the hawthorn stake. The choice was not arbitrary. It was theologically grounded. The hawthorn's thorns understood to be sacred because of their association with the crown of thorns. to stake a vampire. With hawthorn was to perform an act of Christian purification. The boundary tree, consecrated by the most significant boundary Christian theology, deployed against the dead who refused to stay on their side of it. In 1725, Austrian officials documented the case of Petr Blagojevic of the village of Kiseljevo. This is one of the best attested vampire cases in recorded history. Not a folktale, an official report. The corpse was exhumed. Austrian military officials were present as witnesses. The body was staked through the heart with hawthorn. Witnesses reported fresh blood pouring from the mouth and ears of the exhumed corpse. The officials wrote this down, signed their names to the account. Whatever one makes of the interpretation, the document exists. The hawthorn stake is not merely folklore. In this case, it is part of an official record of the Austrian Empire. In Bulgaria, in 1882, a similar procedure was carried out with additional thoroughness. A corpse found full of fresh blood, a hawthorn thorn driven into its breast, and then the body burned on a pyre of hawthorn branches, the tree serving both purposes simultaneously, the instrument of killing and the fuel for destruction. The hawthorn completing the entire process, beginning it and ending it. The Serbian folk tradition was specific about the hawthorn used for staking. It could not be just any hawthorn from any hedgerow. A Serbian folk manual specified that the wood must have come from a tree grown in the high mountains, in a place from which the bush could not have seen the sea. I want to sit with that phrase for a moment. A place from which the bush could not have seen the sea. The provenance of the tree mattered to its power, its isolation, its distance from the ordinary world. A hawthorn grown in proximity to human settlement, to the coast, to the traffic of ordinary life, was insufficient. The power required for this particular threshold work demanded a tree that had grown in difficulty, in remoteness, in the high cold places. The most resilient hawthorn, the one that had persisted in the hardest conditions. Prevention was as important as cure in the Serbian tradition. A small hawthorn peg, driven into a grave beside a cross, was believed to prevent a corpse from rising in the first place. Not a remedy after the fact, a precaution taken before the problem began. The Roma took a different but equally considered approach. They drove hawthorn into the sock of the buried corpse, not into the heart, into the foot, the thorns placed at the point of exit, at the feet where a vampire was understood to leave the grave, preventing the body from rising by blocking the precise mechanism of its rising. And beyond the grave, the threshold guardian tradition continued in Slavic belief as it had in Roman and Celtic. A branch of hawthorn placed at the entrance to a house would prevent vampires from entering. Cardia used hawthorn against the strigers at the ermine doorway. Serbian households used hawthorn against vampires at the Slavic one. Different cultures, different centuries, different names for the malevolent force being kept outside. The same tree at the same threshold, performing the same function. The Indo-European root belief surfacing again in yet another tradition, the hawthorn at the doorway. The boundary between the living and whatever threatens them from outside, as it has always been, as it continues to be in the places where these traditions are still observed. The crown of thorns. Medieval and early modern tradition widely held that it was woven from hawthorn. Not every tradition agreed. Other plants have been proposed. The question was debated by theologians across several centuries. But hawthorn was the most persistent candidate, the most widely believed. And this belief did considerable work in the tradition that followed from it. If the crown of thorns was hawthorn, then the hawthorn thorn was sanctified by the Passion. It had touched the head of Christ. It had been present at the most significant threshold in Christian theology, the boundary between mortal life and divine sacrifice. This gave the hawthorn's protective qualities a theological grounding that the older folk traditions had expressed in other terms. The fairy thorn at the threshold, the Roman cardier's sacred bough, the vampire stake of Serbian tradition, all of them now underwritten by the same theological claim. The hawthorn protects because it was consecrated by the crucifixion, a pre-existing belief given a new explanation that the Christian world could accept. Some early Christian commentators went further. They identified the burning bush of Exodus as a hawthorn, the bush that burned without being consumed, through which God spoke to Moses. A hawthorn, in this reading, was the first vessel through which the divine spoke directly to a human being. The boundary tree as the site of divine communication, the threshold through which the sacred voice passed into the mortal world. Whether or not one accepts the botanical identification, the interpretive instinct is consistent. Place the hawthorn at the most significant threshold. It belongs there. The vampire's fear of hawthorn was explained in Eastern European Christian theology through the same logic. A vampire is a creature inimical to Christ's sacrifice. It feeds on living blood. It refuses the death that Christ's death was meant to redeem. It cannot endure contact with the wood that touched Christ's head. The hawthorn stake was not merely a physical weapon. It was a theological argument, made in wood, driven through the heart of what refused to stay on the correct side of the boundary. The Church also used the hawthorn's associations for its own purposes, though less heroically. The May Day celebrations entered on hawthorn were sexually charged, abundantly so. The maypole, the night in the woods, the May Queen, the blossom in the bridal bed. The Church was not comfortable with any of this. And so, according to several historical accounts, it deliberately spread the belief that hawthorn blossom brought illness and death when brought indoors. An attempt to redirect the tree's power to attach consequences to the flower's domestic use, to discourage the May Day customs by making the central plant of those customs frightening rather than festive. The prohibition that may have had practical roots in the plague years was given institutional reinforcement for entirely different reasons. The same tree, sanctified by the crown of thorns, in one sentence, made dangerous by its blossom in the next. The hawthorn, as ever, holding contradictions without resolving them. We are now in territory that feels, to me, rather more like home. The Renaissance and the early modern period. The great herbalists whose books line my shelves, whose arguments I learned before, I learned to argue back. John Gerard published his herbal in 1597, the first major English herbal, a vast and ambitious undertaking. It brought together the available botanical knowledge of the era into a single English volume, and it included the hawthorn as it had to. Though I should note, in the spirit of honest apothecary practice, that Gerard's text borrowed heavily from the Belgian herbalist Dodon's, without acknowledgement, without particular scruple about the borrowing. Renaissance botany was, in many respects, an accumulation and translation of classical knowledge rather than a record of original observation. This does not diminish what Gerard achieved, but it is worth knowing when you read him. John Parkinson's Theatrum Botanicum of 1640 was more rigorous and introduced an important correction. He argued that the plant Dioscorides had called Oxyacantha was likely a Pyracantha rather than a true Crataegus. A critical distinction, one that had been confused in European medical writing for 15 centuries. 15 centuries of physicians citing Dioscorides on hawthorn, possibly describing a different plant entirely. Parkinson had the intellectual confidence to say so, and the botanical knowledge to make the case. The tradition was not undermined by this correction, but it was clarified, made more precise. This is how knowledge actually advances, not through dramatic discoveries alone, but through someone pausing to ask whether we have been describing the right thing. Then Nicholas Culpeper, published his English Physician in 1652. I have spoken of him before. I hold him, as I said of him, in another context, with somewhat mixed feelings. He was a man of considerable ability and almost unlimited confidence. He was also someone who did something that mattered enormously. He published in plain English, deliberately at a price ordinary people could afford. The College of Physicians resisted this bitterly. They understood what it meant. Medical knowledge available to common people was medical authority was no longer exclusively theirs. Culpeper made the hawthorn available to anyone who could read, which was, in the 17th century, a radical act. He placed hawthorn under the dominion of Mars. This was an unusual assignment. Most of the heart herbs in his system fell under Venus or the Sunday. Culpeper gave the hawthorn to Mars, the planet of war, of sharpness, of penetrating force. Fierce, protective, penetrating sharp. It is, when you consider the tree, not an unreasonable characterization. The thorns that cannot be removed without tearing the bark. The wood harder than most timber trees. The hedge that nothing can penetrate. The guardian that allows nothing through unless it chooses to. Mars, for Culpeper, was not merely aggressive. It was the energy of fortification, of active defense. The hawthorn understood as a Martian plant is the hawthorn understood as armor for the body it protects. The doctrine of signatures read the hawthorn in more literal terms. The red berries were associated with blood and with the heart. The thorns with the penetrating, strengthening properties required to fortify a weakened cardiovascular system, wrong in its mechanism, as the doctrine of signatures usually was, pointing in the right direction, as it occasionally did when the resemblance was accurate enough. The red berry and the heart. The connection that centuries of later medicine would confirm through entirely different means. The apothecary records of the 17th and 18th centuries show hawthorn preparations prescribed for dropsy, for edema, for for kidney stones and bladder complaints. The cardiac benefits were being observed empirically before any practitioner had a framework to explain them. Patients improved. The practitioners recorded the improvement. They prescribed the preparation again. They did not know why it worked. They knew that it did. This is how traditional medicine accumulated its most reliable knowledge, not through theory, but through the accumulation of observed outcomes. I should say something about the shops in which these preparations were dispensed, because the apothecary premises of 17th and 18th century England were remarkable environments. Hawthorn tinctures sat on the shelves alongside dried alligators, flying fish, alchemical distillates of uncertain provenance. The entire spectrum of natural philosophy compressed into a single aromatic, chaotic room. What worked and what did not work were not yet cleanly separated. The hawthorn berry occupied the same shelf as preparations that would not survive rational scrutiny for another generation. It was not elevated above them. It simply continued to work while they were eventually discarded. The reliable and the fantastic sitting together in the same cabinet, waiting for the era that would learn to tell them apart. The French physician, Henry Leclerc, documented hawthorn's use for heart conditions in the early modern period. His observations formed a bridge between the Renaissance herbal tradition and the more rigorous inquiry of the Enlightenment, between what practitioners had noticed across centuries and what a new era was beginning to test more carefully. The cardiac thread, which Paracelsus had identified, and the doctrine of signatures had associated with red berries and blood, was becoming more precise, more clinical, more documented, still without a mechanism, but accumulating the kind of consistent observation that demands one eventually. I want to tell you about a physician in County Clare, Dr. Green of Ennis, his first name not reliably recorded, his reputation very much so. He developed a reputation for curing heart disease that drew patients from across the United Kingdom, not merely from Ireland, from England, Scotland, Wales, people who had exhausted other options traveling to a small town in County Clare to see one physician. He died in 1894, and after his death, his daughter revealed what his famous secret remedy had been. A tincture of ripe hawthorn berries. Nothing more, nothing exotic, nothing that required traveling to County Clare to obtain. The berries from the hedge at the edge of any field in Britain or Ireland, prepared as a tincture dispensed to patients who had come from hundreds of miles away. I find this story one of the more affecting in the entire hawthorn record. A man who built a career on a plant that any child could pick in October, whose secret, when it was finally revealed, was not a secret at all. Just the hawthorn berry, correctly prepared, given consistently to people who needed it. 2 years after Dr. Green's death, the New York Medical Journal published a report. Dr. McJennings of Chicago, 43 patients with various heart conditions, treated with a fluid extract of hawthorn berries. Apparently, curative results in all of them. 43 out of 43. This is a remarkable clinical claim. It attracted attention. It attracted further use. Hawthorn entered American clinical practice in 1896 on the strength of that and similar reports. For several decades, it was used with considerable success. And then, in the 1930s, synthetic pharmaceuticals began to displace it. Not because hawthorn had stopped working, because newer preparations were considered more modern, more scientific, more controllable in their dosing. The hawthorn faded from clinical use in America, as so many traditional plant remedies did in that era. The trajectory of a useful thing displaced not by something better, but by something newer. Both homeopathic and allopathic doctors across 19th century Europe used hawthorn preparations for cardiovascular ailments. Consistent clinical success, documented in both traditions. And yet systematic research to explain why hawthorn worked would not begin until the 20th century. A century of practitioners observing the effect without anyone yet asking the question of mechanism with sufficient rigor. The observation was reliable. The explanation was still coming. Now I must tell you about something that happened to the hawthorn hedge itself in this period, because the history of the hedge in the 18th and 19th centuries is not a comfortable one. The Enclosure Acts passed between 1750 and 1850. Roughly, they drove the planting of approximately 200,000 miles of hawthorn hedgerow across England. 200,000 miles. The transformation of the Midlands landscape, fields carved out of common land, boundaries imposed where none had been before, and the hawthorn, the boundary tree, planted at every new enclosure to mark the taking. The Enclosure Acts dispossessed thousands of commoners of land that had worked for generations. Land that had been common, shared, available to those who had no other resource. The hawthorn hedge that went in behind the enclosure notice was the visible mark of that dispossession. The boundary tree made into an instrument of social control. The plant that had always stood at the edge between the managed world and the wild one, now planted to manage the wild one out of existence. This had happened before. The Midland Revolt of 1607 was a mass uprising against enclosure. Those who tore down the hawthorn hedges, being planted to enclose common land, gave themselves a name. Levellers. The hawthorn hedge raised to enclose. The hawthorn hedge torn down in revolt. The same plant. The tool of dispossession and the target of the dispossessed. The boundary tree at the center of a conflict about who had the right to draw boundaries and who had to live within them. The 200,000 miles of hedge planted under the Enclosure Acts remain, many of them, today. The oldest of them are now the most biodiverse. The instrument of dispossession become, across 3 centuries, one of the most important wildlife habitats in England. The hawthorn does not concern itself with the uses to which it has been put. It grows where it is planted. It supports what it can support. The 300 species of insects that depend on it are not troubled by the history. Only the humans who planted it, and the humans who tore it down, and the humans who now walk beside it carry that weight. Let us set medicine aside for a moment. Not permanently. We will return to it. But I want to spend some time in the kitchen rather than the dispensary, because the hawthorn's food history is long and considerably more pleasurable to recount than most of what we have discussed this evening. The young shoots first. We have already met them. Bread and cheese. The first fresh green thing after winter. Eaten raw. Standing at the hedgerow in early spring. But the berry is where the culinary tradition becomes most interesting. The haw has a character that requires understanding before it reveals itself. Dry, astringent, mealy in texture, not inviting eaten raw in any quantity, but cook it, sweeten it, apply a little patience and a little vinegar, and something different emerges. Haw jelly is perhaps the most elegant of the hawthorn preparations, made possible by the berry's exceptionally high pectin content. Pectin is what makes a preserve set, what gives jelly its clean, trembling consistency. Commercial pectin is now sold in packets, but it was not always necessary. The hawthorn berry contains enough of its own pectin to produce a clean set without any additional help. The country cook who made haw jelly needed only the berries, water, sugar, and thyme. No specialist ingredient, no trip to any shop. Everything required was in the hedge at the field's edge. The haw ketchup predates the tomato ketchup that now dominates British tables by centuries. Cooked berries, vinegar and spice, a condiment, tart and savory, serving the same culinary function that tomato ketchup would later serve. Before the American fruit arrived in British kitchens, before the tomato was accepted as food rather than ornament, the hawthorn was already doing this work. A hedgerow condiment with a history as long as British cooking itself. The hawthorn berry wine is described by those who have made it as resembling a fragrant floral sherry, one of the oldest country wines in the British Isles, made in farmhouses and cottages across the centuries in the weeks after the autumn harvest. The berries picked before the birds stripped the hedge bare, which required some promptness. Cooked down, strained, fermented with sugar, bottled and left to develop. A wine with a hedge in it. The taste of the autumn boundary in a glass. The nutritional reality of the haw is worth stating. Rich in B vitamins, in folic acid, in vitamin C. The antioxidant content we have already noted, more than 20 times the activity of vitamin C alone, in some measures. The country tradition of harvesting and eating haws was not merely a rural habit. It was a meaningful contribution to the nutritional resilience of populations living through food insecurity. In the lean months of late autumn and early winter, the haw was still there, still available, still nourishing. When all fruit fails, welcome haws, the Irish expression again. True in the kitchen as much as in mythology. A syrup of hawthorn berries diluted with water, lemon juice, and brandy was a traditional cold remedy. The brandy, both preserving the preparation and warming the patient. A formula that would have been entirely recognizable to an 18th century apothecary, and entirely recognizable with minor variations to anyone who has ever made a hot toddy. The line between the medicinal and the pleasurable in the hawthorn tradition has never been firm. The cold remedy and the winter drink are substantially the same preparation. You drink it because you are unwell. You might also drink it because it is a cold evening and you are not. The hawthorn does not distinguish between these motivations. China gives us something rather more poetic. Pear soup made with hawthorn berries, a traditional therapeutic recipe in northern China. made for hundreds of years, still made now. The pear's cooling, moistening quality combined with the hawthorn's digestive and cardiovascular properties. 2 fruits in a bowl of warm liquid, neither food nor medicine, but both simultaneously. The Chinese medical philosophy expressed this principle with a phrase I find quietly beautiful: the homology of medicine and food. The understanding that nourishing and healing are not distinguished at the deeper level, that what feeds the body and what supports it are, at their best, the same act. The hawthorn pear soup is that philosophy made edible, served warm in a bowl to someone who needs both comfort and support. The distinction between the kitchen and the dispensary are dissolved in a single preparation. I have always felt that the best herbal medicine works this way, not as intervention, separate from daily life, but as an extension of how daily life is nourished. The hawthorn, perhaps better than any plant I know, exemplifies this. It has been food and medicine, hedge and hearth, condiment and remedy for as long as anyone has been eating from hedgerows. The boundary tree, as it always has been, between what feeds us and what heals us. We have arrived at the laboratory. I want to approach this section with the same care I have tried to bring to everything else we have discussed tonight. Not credulity, not dismissal, attention. In 2010, a meta-analysis was published examining the clinical evidence for hawthorn in cardiovascular disease. A meta-analysis examines multiple studies simultaneously. It is among the more rigorous forms of medical review. The conclusion was measured in its language, as such documents are required to be. Hawthorn showed significant potential as a useful remedy in the treatment of cardiovascular disease. Significant potential. In the language of formal science, that is a considered endorsement. 2,000 years of traditional medicine formally validated. Dr. Green of County Clare vindicated 17 years after his death. The active constituents responsible for these effects have now been identified with considerable precision. In the leaves, oligomeric procyanidins, opses. In the flowers, vitexin and its glycoside derivatives. Together, a complex of flavonoids performing several distinct cardiovascular functions simultaneously. They dilate blood vessels. They protect cardiac muscle from oxidative damage. And they inhibit an enzyme called the angiotensin converting enzyme. The angiotensin converting enzyme, the ACE. I want to pause on this for a moment, because it matters more than it might first appear. ACE inhibitor drugs are now among the most commonly prescribed cardiovascular medications in the world. They lower blood pressure. They reduce the heart's workload. They are a cornerstone of modern cardiology. The pharmaceutical industry developed them through rigorous research across the second half of the 20th century. And the hawthorn berry had been inhibiting the same enzyme for as long as anyone had been eating haws. The plant anticipated one of modern cardiology's most important discoveries by approximately 2,000 years. Without knowing what the ACE enzyme was, without knowing the mechanism, simply by being eaten, by being prepared as a tincture, by being the secret remedy of a physician in County Clare. One large, randomized controlled trial examined hawthorn, added to standard therapy for heart failure. The result was significant. Hawthorn reduced the incidence of sudden cardiac death by 39% compared with placebo. 39%. In the context of heart failure, where sudden cardiac death is among the most feared outcomes, that is a substantial figure. Not a marginal improvement, not a trend that requires cautious interpretation. A 39% reduction. In a randomized controlled trial, the red berries of the boundary hedge, delivering this result. The cholesterol work is equally striking. Long-term consumption of hawthorn extract has been shown to reduce total cholesterol levels by 15 to 20% in patients with hyperlipidemia. This is comparable to commonly used lipid-lowering medications, achieved without their side effects. The plant doing the work of the pharmaceutical without the pharmaceutical's costs to the body. This is not a claim I make carelessly. The comparison is from the clinical literature, not from my own advocacy. Now, I want to tell you about something that neither the traditional practitioners nor the patients they treated ever knew was happening. The hawthorn flavonoids, as modern research has revealed, are not merely cardiovascular in their action. They are simultaneously neuroprotective, hepatoprotective, nephroprotective, protecting neural tissue, protecting the liver, protecting the kidneys. The apothecary who dispensed hawthorn tincture for a patient's heart complaint in the 18th century was, without either party's knowledge, also protecting that patient's liver and their brain and their kidneys. The medicine was doing more than it was asked to do, more than the practitioner prescribed, more than the patient knew to expect, working quietly across multiple systems simultaneously, while everyone involved understood it as a heart remedy only. China, Germany, and France have all listed hawthorn in their national pharmacopoeias. This is a rare distinction. Most medicinal plants achieve formal recognition in one tradition or another, to be listed simultaneously in traditional Chinese medicine and Western phytotherapy, confirmed independently by the regulatory authorities of multiple nations, places hawthorn in a very small category. The plants, whose evidence base is robust enough to satisfy entirely different systems of evaluation. The same berry in the Tangben Tao and in the German pharmacopoeia. The same flavonoids assessed by Chinese and European criteria alike and found sufficient. Hawthorn has been demonstrated safe for use by patients with existing heart disease, used in clinical trials alongside standard heart medications without adverse interaction. This matters because many herbal preparations interact with pharmaceutical drugs in ways that require caution. Hawthorn, in the doses and preparations studied, has not demonstrated this problem. It works alongside conventional treatment rather than against it. The 2,000-year remedy and the 20th century drug, compatible in the same patient. Vitexin, one of hawthorn's key flavone compounds, has recently shown activity in inhibiting tumor cell proliferation, regulating cyclin-dependent kinases, a mechanism relevant to cancer research. The heart herb, finding potential application in an entirely different field. The research is preliminary. I present it as such. But it suggests that hawthorn's pharmacological range may be broader still than the cardiovascular tradition has explored. Another drawer in the chest, to borrow a phrase, I find useful, not yet fully open. And the neuroprotective work deserves a moment of particular attention. The chlorogenic acid and epicatechin content of hawthorn berries has shown activity in protecting neural tissue. In the laboratory studies where this has been examined, the results suggest genuine neuroprotective. Now, the folkloric tradition held that hawthorn enhanced perception, that the blossom opened second sight, that Biddy Early's gifts came partly from sleeping beneath the thorn. I am not suggesting these beliefs were pharmacologically accurate, but the old folkloric connection between hawthorn and enhanced perception now has, as one researcher put it, a faint pharmacological shadow. The neural protection conferred by the berry's compounds does not explain second sight, but it places the plant in proximity to the nervous system in a way the tradition, through entirely different language, had also noticed. The observation came first. The mechanism is still arriving, as it so often has, across the long history we have been tracing tonight. I want to spend some time now in the territory that makes the hawthorn genuinely unusual. Not unusual among medicinal plants, unusual among plants of any kind. Because what we have been tracing all evening is a plant that holds contradictions without resolving them. And I think it is worth naming some of those contradictions directly. Let us begin with the smell again, because there is something about the trimethylamine question that I have not yet fully addressed. In earlier centuries, bodies were laid out in homes for several days after death, without refrigeration, in the rooms where families lived. The smell of human decomposition in its early stages was a familiar domestic smell, not sought, not welcomed, but known. An 18th century nose encountered death in the home regularly. When that nose smelled hawthorn blossom, the trimethylamine registered against a much more immediate reference point. The association of hawthorn with mortality was visceral in a way that requires some effort for us to reconstruct. We who have never smelled decomposition in our own rooms, who have never laid out a body in a front parlor. The hawthorn hedge was blossoming beside people who knew exactly what that smell meant. And yet they brought it to their weddings. And yet the young women wore it in their hair. Marcel Proust described hawthorn blossom as an intense, almost overwhelming sensory trigger for memory and longing. Ted Hughes called it scent, a nauseous, sweet aniseed odor. Chemically identical flowers, two of the 20th century's greatest writers, opposite aesthetic responses. Both responses chemically accurate, the trimethylamine doing different things in different nervous systems, or doing the same thing. And those two nervous systems interpreting it differently. Proust leaning into the ambiguity, Hughes recoiling from it, the hawthorn blossom indifferent to both responses. It is not producing that scent for writers. It is producing it for flies. The scent was understood in pre-modern Britain as a form of communication. The fairy guardians signaling their presence through the trimethylamine. There is an irony in this that the tradition could not have known. Trimethylamine is literally a signaling molecule. evolved to communicate between organisms. It speaks to carrion insects in a language of death and opportunity. It was not evolved to speak to humans. Humans, encountering it at the hedgerow, heard something in it, called it fairy presence, called it the guardian signaling. The instinct that something was communicating was not entirely wrong. Something was communicating, yes, not to them specifically. Now, I want to tell you about a car factory in Belfast, the DeLorean Motor Company, the stainless steel car with the gull-wing doors. Its factory was built in Belfast in the 1980s. Irish commentators noted that the construction had disturbed a fairy thorn tree. The company failed catastrophically. The cars did not sell. The factory closed. The story illustrates something I find genuinely interesting. Not whether the fairy thorn caused the failure. That is a question I leave entirely to the listener. But that in 20th century Ireland, the story was told at all. That it was considered a credible explanation by a significant number of people. That the hawthorn belief retained sufficient cultural force in a modern industrial economy to be invoked as correlation for corporate collapse. The belief did not die with the medieval world. It adapted. Then there is the matter of what happened to the Glastonbury thorn in 2010. The tree on Wearial Hill was attacked with a chainsaw. The branches were severed. The tree was badly damaged. The response was national outrage. Not merely local distress, not merely the concern of those interested in heritage. National outrage, media coverage, politicians responding as if a crime had been committed against the nation itself, which reveals something. How much of the tree's ancient significance remained embedded in collective cultural memory. The mythology of the Glastonbury thorn, the Joseph of Arimathea legend, miraculous double flowering, the Christmas cutting for the monarch. All of it still present enough in the national consciousness that an attack on the tree felt like an attack on something fundamental. The tree cut down during the Reformation by Puritan iconoclasts. The tree cut again in 2010. Both times, people preserved what they could. Both times, the tradition continued. Consider time. A hawthorn standing in a field today may have been alive during the English Civil War, may have been alive during the Black Death, may have been a living presence when the Normans arrived. Individual hawthorns can survive several hundred years. Some claim specimens exceed 500. The boundary tree at the edge of the field, apparently unremarkable, possibly older than anything else in the landscape. Older than the farmhouse behind it, older than the road beside it. The oldest thing in the view, dressed in ordinary thorns, offering nothing that announces its age. Hooper's rule is a tool for reading hedgerow age that deserves to be better known. Developed by the ecologist Max Hooper in the 1970s, count the distinct woody species in any 30-yard length of hedgerow. Multiply by 99. The result is the approximate age of the hedge in years. A hawthorn-dominant hedge with few other species is almost certainly a product of the Enclosure Acts. Planted in haste with one species to mark a boundary quickly. A species-rich hedge with hawthorn, blackthorn, elder, holly, hazel, and others interwoven may be medieval. Or older. The next time you walk beside a hedgerow, you can read its history with your eyes. count the species, multiply by 99. The hedge will tell you when it was planted, if you know how to ask. The hedge school tradition in Pennell Island adds another layer to the hawthorn's political history. Under the penal laws, Catholic children in Ireland were forbidden formal education, and so they were taught outdoors, in secret, in the shelter of hawthorn hedges. The hedge school, the name was not metaphorical, the hedge was the school. The hawthorn's dense growth provided concealment. Its thorns discouraged casual investigation. The boundary tree, sheltering those the law sought to keep outside the boundary of education. A tree with a history of sheltering the dispossessed, doing it again. The levellers who tore down hawthorn hedges in 1607. The Irish children who learned to read in their shelter. The hawthorn on both sides of every dispossession. In 864 AD, the Frankish emperor Charles the Bold was already troubled by the hawthorn hedge. He complained that unauthorized men were constructing what he called hazet fertils, tightly interwoven hawthorn hedges used as fortifications. The military potential of the living barrier recognized a full millennium before the Enclosure Acts. The same impenetrable thicket that protected nesting birds from foxes, protecting human territory from soldiers. The thorns that cannot be removed without tearing the bark, arranged in a living wall. An emperor writing a formal complaint about it in 864 AD. The hawthorn was being deployed as a weapon of territorial control before most European nations existed in their present forms. The fairy paths of Ireland are worth considering as a geographical phenomenon. Lines along which the AOSIC were believed to travel between their mounds, delineated in many cases by lines of hawthorn trees. This created a supernatural geography, an invisible infrastructure of routes and boundaries. Houses were not built across fairy paths. Roads were not laid across them. The landscape was shaped by the belief centuries. What we might call an irrational constraint on development was, in effect, a conservation tool. The hawthorn lined fairy paths preserved corridors of ancient landscape from human development by an entirely different mechanism than the one usually invoked for conservation. Fear rather than ecological understanding. The outcome, in many cases, similar. Draco Malfoy's wand in the Harry Potter novels is made of hawthorn. J.K. Rowling drew from British folk tradition, in which hawthorn was the wood of ambiguity, of power, and of morally complex magic. Not the Elder Wand, which we discussed in another context, a different kind of power. The hawthorn wand in the novels works for its holder, but carries an instability, a tension, as the tree carries its contradictions. The beautiful blossom and the death smell, the bridal garland and the vampire stake. The protection at the threshold and the weapon against those who cross it unwelcome. Rowling understood something true about the hawthorn in giving it to that particular character. A wand for someone who has not yet decided which side of the boundary he belongs on. And finally, the apothecary's most counterintuitive fact, the ACE enzyme. The hawthorn tincture, the 18th century patient. An apothecary dosing a patient with hawthorn for elevated blood pressure in 1750 was achieving the same biochemical intervention as a physician prescribing Remipral today. Exactly the same molecular pathway, exactly the same mechanism of action. Neither the apothecary nor the patient knew this. Neither had the faintest concept of the angiotensin converting enzyme. The apothecary reached for the jar because it worked. As the patient improved, because 2,000 years of practitioners before him had observed the same improvement and recorded it. The mechanism was invisible to all of them. The outcome was not, and the berry in the hedge, unprompted by any human understanding, had been providing that outcome all along. The boundary tree at the boundary of what we knew, doing its work quietly, without requiring anyone to understand it. There is a question I find myself returning to after everything we have traced tonight. Not a question about the chemistry, not about the folklore. A question about what it means that so many different things are true of the same plant simultaneously. Consider the hedge. The medieval villager and the 18th century enclosure landlord both planted hawthorn hedges. The medieval hedge was a communal boundary maintained in common, a shared structure of a shared world. The enclosure hedge was planted to exclude the community from land they had previously held in common. The same species, the same thorns, the same white flowers in May, performing opposite social functions in successive centuries. The tree entirely indifferent to the politics of those who planted it, growing equally well in the service of community and in the service of its destruction. This is not a comfortable thought, but it is an honest one. The hawthorn has never belonged to any single human purpose. It has served all of them. The ancient Irish Brehon laws placed the hawthorn under legal protection. Cutting down certain sacred trees, hawthorn among them, carried formal legal penalties, not merely social disapproval, not merely spiritual consequence. Law, enforceable civic law. The tree's protection was a matter of jurisprudence, as well as religion and natural philosophy. Law, religion, and natural philosophy converging in the hawthorn hedge, in ways entirely foreign to how modern jurisprudence thinks about trees. The sacred and the legal were not separate categories in the Brehon tradition. The hawthorn existed at the point where they met in Wales and in the sacred triad of Welsh and Scottish tradition. Hawthorn stands alongside blackthorn and rowan, three trees, each governing a season and a quality of power. Blackthorn with winter and the dark half of the year, hawthorn with the bright half, with summer's promise, with the flowering that announces what is coming. Rowan with protection, with the active warding of what seeks to harm. Three trees, dividing the year's spiritual character between them. The hawthorn taking the bright half, the season of light and growth and the flowering that follows the cold. And yet it also carries death and liminal darkness and the vampire stake and the smell of decay. Even in the triad that assigns it to brightness, the hawthorn carries its shadow. Oh, the white of hawthorn blossom was understood across Celtic cultures as one of the colors of the other world, along with silver and pale gold. When the May hedgerow came into flower, the landscape was suddenly saturated with otherworld color. The ordinary English or Irish countryside briefly wearing the palette of the fairy realm. Every field edge a possible threshold, every flowering hedge a possible doorway. The white that means wedding, and the white, that means the other world, present in the same blossom at the same moment. Now, the practice of sleeping at sacred sites to receive healing or prophecy. The ancient Greeks had a name for it, incubation. Patients of the sanctuaries of Asclepius would sleep within the sacred precinct. They expected to receive dreams that would diagnose their illness or prescribe their cure. The god communicated through sleep. The sacred site enabled the communication. Biddy, early sleeping beneath hawthorn trees. The second site that came to her there, the Irish folk healer and the oracle sleepers of ancient Greece are describing the same mechanism. Different traditions, different vocabularies, different centuries, the same act. The same understanding that sleep at a sacred threshold opens something not available in ordinary waking. The hawthorn, as the Irish equivalent of Asclepius's sanctuary. The tradition that produced Biddy early is a continuation of something that predates Christianity in Ireland by millennia. The Christianization of hawthorn's folklore is one of the more sustained botanical projects in Western religious history. The crown of thorns, the burning bush, the Glastonbury legend. Centuries of reinterpreting a pagan sacred plant within a Christian, not eliminating the older associations, not replacing them, absorbing them, giving them new Christian explanations while the older ones persisted underneath. The fairy thorn and the crown of thorns existing simultaneously in the same culture's understanding of the same tree. The medieval peasant who placed hawthorn above the stable door to keep out fairies, and the theologian who explained hawthorn's protective power through the Passion. Both, right? In their own frameworks, both drawing on the same tree. The hawthorn is theoretically capable of apomictic reproduction, producing seeds without fertilization, cloning itself. This characteristic may explain something that has puzzled archaeobotanists: the survival of ancient hawthorn lines at sacred sites, perpetuating themselves unchanged over millennia. The hawthorn standing at the entrance to the megalithic tomb may not be descended from a tree planted there by Neolithic people. It may be, in a meaningful biological sense, that same tree, reproducing itself identically, generation after generation. The continuity at the threshold may be more literal than anyone has supposed. In Serbia and the Balkans, the hawthorn brought wealth and prosperity to the family on whose land it grew. This coexisted with its role as vampire stake and funeral pyre fuel. Wealth and protection against the undead, prosperity, the wood that kills what refuses to die. The Balkan tradition held both simultaneously without apparent contradiction, as every tradition that has lived long enough with this plant has held its contradictions. The hawthorn does not resolve. It contains. Now, I want to tell you about something small, domestic, almost tender. In some parts of Britain, a folk belief persisted into recent centuries. If you pulled a hawthorn blossom apart and smelled the center closely, you were briefly transported in spirit to the fairy realm. A momentary crossing, involuntary, available to anyone who pushed their nose into a mayflower. The trimethylamine is most concentrated at the blossom's center. The highest concentration of the compound that affects human neurochemistry in ways we do not fully understand. The folk belief was grounded, accidentally, in a genuine physiological event. Not transportation to the fairy realm, but something happening in the nervous system at close proximity to the concentrated scent. Something subtle enough to be interpreted as a crossing, a brief disturbance of the ordinary. The folk belief and the pharmacology are not describing the same thing, but they are not entirely unconnected either. The hawthorn belongs to the rose family. We established this at the beginning of our evening. It is a botanical cousin of the strawberry, the cherry, the plum, the peach, the almond, and the blackberry. Every one of those cousins was cultivated, celebrated, developed through centuries of human attention into prized fruit crops. The hawthorn was domesticated only for its thorns, its edible fruit neglected, its medicinal properties developed slowly and without the investment given to it. The most medicinally powerful member of the family, consistently overlooked as food, while its relatives were bred for sweetness and abundance. The hawthorn was planted for defense. The apothecary's plant, left at the edge of the field while its cousins were brought into the orchard. Hawthorn tea made from dried flowers and leaves is now sold commercially in Germany, listed in the official pharmacopoeia, available in standardized capsule form to millions of Europeans. The preparation, an 18th century apothecary made by hand from hedgerow material, available now in a packet on a pharmacy shelf. The same preparation, the same active compounds. The standardization and the standardized dose have changed. The hawthorn has not. I find something worth noting in this. The apothecary's hawthorn, harvested from the hedge behind his physic garden, and the pharmacist's hawthorn capsule are substantially the same medicine, separated by 2 centuries of pharmaceutical development that, in this particular case, has not improved very much on what was already available. Consider the physic garden hedge itself for a moment. The hawthorn hedge, planted between an 18th century apothecary's physic garden and the outside world. A physical boundary, keeping livestock out, marking the garden's extent. And in the folk imagination, the same hedge was separating the world of the living from the world of spirits. Medicine and mythology sharing the same botanical boundary. The apothecary inside the hedge, preparing his tinctures from plants whose magical associations he may or may not have taken seriously. The hawthorn enclosing him, protecting the physic garden, at the boundary between the domestic world of medicine and whatever lay outside it, as it has always been, at every boundary, performing every function, entirely indifferent to which side of it you believe you are standing on. We have covered a great deal of ground tonight. Let me take some time now to draw threads together, to look at the pattern rather than the individual facts. Because the hawthorn's history is not merely a collection of interesting things. It has a shape, and the shape is worth examining. The Islamic Golden Age scholars knew hawthorn as Zarur. They included it in their pharmacological texts as a treatment for gastric complaints and heart weakness, working simultaneously with the medieval European tradition, independently confirming the same properties. The same convergence we saw with elder, the same convergence we see with every plant that actually works. When Arab scholars and European monks arrive at the same preparation for the same complaint without comparing notes, that is not coincidence. That is the plant teaching the same lesson to anyone who observed it carefully enough. Consider what the names preserve. The French orpine, from Old French Albe spine, white thorn. The German Weißdorn, white thorn. The English white thorn, white thorn. Across multiple European languages, independent of each other, same two qualities named. White and sharp, blossom and defense, never one without the other. No European language named the hawthorn for its fruit alone, for its medicine, for its food value. They all named it for the combination, for the beauty and the wound held in the same plant. The languages knew something. The botanists later confirmed with chemistry. The Arthurian legend places Merlin's tomb in living hawthorn, not stone, not earth, not the sea, a living tree. This is one of the few instances in European mythology where a great figure's final resting place is organic rather than mineral. The boundary between life and death dissolved in the hawthorn's living tissue. Merlin neither fully dead nor fully alive. The hawthorn neither fully of this world nor the other. The most powerful wizard in British mythology, contained by the most liminal tree in the British landscape, and his voice still audible in the rustling leaves on still days. The boundary between the imprisoned and the free, as permeable as the boundary the tree has always marked. The Glastonbury thorn was cut down by Puritan iconoclasts because it was too contradictory. A sacred pagan tree, producing what appeared to be a miraculous Christian sign. The winter flowering, the botanical embodiment of pagan and Christian calendars reconciled. Puritan theology could not accommodate this, could not allow a pagan tree to perform a Christian miracle. And so they cut it down to eliminate the contradiction. But the tree had already sent its children into the countryside. Cuttings taken, the genetic material preserved, the contradiction persisting in the descendants, still flowering twice, still sending its Christmas cutting to the monarch. You cannot eliminate a contradiction by cutting down the tree that holds it. The hawthorn has always known how to begin again. The oldest written hawthorn recipe may well be Ovid's. His record of placing hawthorn boughs at doorways for Cartier's protection. First century of the Common Era, 2,000 years ago, and the May Day custom of placing hawthorn above the door continued in rural Britain into the 20th century. 2,000 years of the same ritual, the same gesture, the same tree at the same threshold. The Roman purpose expressed in terms of cardia and the striges. The British purpose expressed in terms of fairy protection and summer welcome. The gesture identical, the underlying intention identical. The longest, continuously practiced hawthorn ritual we can document, still within living memory, still within the recollection of people. The instability of folk belief is worth dwelling on for a moment. The Isle of Man and Ireland are separated by a short sea crossing. On the Irish side, sleeping beneath hawthorn on May Eve brings abduction or death. On the Manx side, sleeping beneath hawthorn on May Eve brings wishes granted by the fairies. The same tree, the same night, the same action, catastrophic on one shore, beneficent on the other. A few miles of water separating two entirely different relationships with the same belief. This is not a weakness in the tradition. It is an honest reflection of what the hawthorn actually is. A plant that does not promise consistent outcomes, that offers power without guaranteeing its direction. The hedgerow thorns are worth a specific observation. Hawthorn specimens growing in hedgerows develop larger, more aggressive thorns than free-growing trees. The constrained plant arms itself more heavily than the free one, as if the hawthorn, pressed into service as a boundary by human planting, responds by becoming more effectively a boundary. The plant and its function reinforcing each other. The hedge that constrains it, producing thorns that make it a better hedge. The old prohibition on bringing May blossom into the house before May Day itself was not, in its original form, a church intervention. It was older than that. Bringing the blossom in before the proper season had opened was understood to drag the fairy world into the domestic realm prematurely. The boundary disturb before the ritual moment that legitimized its crossing. The hawthorn's threshold power was not available at all times. It required the correct seasonal moment. Outside that moment, the boundary should not be moved. The church later gave this prohibition its own explanation. The fairy explanation was the original one. A sprig of hawthorn found on a windowsill on May Eve, not placed there deliberately, understood in parts of northern England as a visitation, a calling card left during the night by spirits that had passed through the thin boundary. The blossom itself as a message, as evidence of presence. The hawthorn as the medium through which the invisible left a material trace. What the modern mind reads as a petal blown in through an open window. What the folk mind read as a communication from whatever moves through the boundary in the hours before dawn. Sprigs of hawthorn in the bedroom were believed to protect the sleeper during astral travel. The fairy guardians of the tree watching over the body while the spirit journeyed, assuring safe return to the waking world. The threshold guardian brought indoors, watching over the most vulnerable kind of boundary crossing. The boundary between the sleeping body and the traveling spirit. The same plant that stood at the entrance to megalithic tombs and fairy mounds, now placed beside the bed. Miniaturized, domesticated. The cosmic threshold guardian reduced to a bedside charm, and yet the same logic, the same function. The hawthorn at the threshold of wherever you are going. American medicine abandoned hawthorn entirely within 40 years of the 1896 New York Medical Journal endorsement, not because it had stopped working, because pharmaceutical fashion moved elsewhere. This is one of the more quietly dismaying facts in the hawthorn record. 2,000 years of consistent observation. A formal clinical endorsement in 1896, and 40 years later, gone from American practice. Institutional fashion, overriding empirical observation, the same pattern that discarded many traditional plant remedies in the mid-20th century. The hawthorn sitting in the hedge through all of it, unchanged, waiting, as it waited through every period in which human attention moved elsewhere. Patient, formed, still there when the attention returned. We are near the end of our evening together. The fire has burned lower. The jars are quieter than they were. I want to use what remains of our time, not to add more facts. Exactly. But to look at what we have gathered and consider what it means. The hawthorn was a famine food before it was a medicine. It was a medicine before it was a mythology. It was a mythology before it was a legal matter. And it was a military fortification before most of these things. And again, and after all of them, British Army manuals of the First World War noted the impenetrability of established hawthorn hedgerows as obstacles. The Sim Living Wall, assessed for its tactical value in modern warfare that had defended Saxon field systems, that had sheltered fairy mounds, that had fortified the territory of Frankish lords in 864. The hawthorn hedge, moving through every era of human conflict without changing its essential nature, still impenetrable, still thorned, still the most effective living barrier available. In Irish tradition, the two most dangerous times to disturb a fairy thorn were Beltane, the two moments in the Celtic year when the boundary between worlds was most thin, at precisely the moments when the tree's protective function was most urgently needed. Its vulnerability was greatest. The guardian most needed at the times when touching it was most dangerous. The logic is uncomfortable, as the hawthorn's logic usually is. The protection and the danger intensifying together, never one without the other. In Welsh and Irish tradition, the fairy mound and the hawthorn tree marking it are understood as the same presence in two forms. The mound is the body of the other world. The hawthorn is its voice, its breath, its threshold made visible above ground. I find this one of the most beautiful formulations in all the hawthorn record. The underground and the above ground connected through the tree, the mound that cannot speak, speaking through the hawthorn that grows from it. The roots going down into wherever the other world is. The branches making it visible, the white flowers announcing it each May. The hawthorn's ability to persist without human assistance is remarkable, even by botanical standards. Seeded by birds, growing from cuttings, cloning itself through apomixis. Every sacred lone thorn in an Irish field may be both a living tree and a botanical ghost of an earlier one. The same genetic line continuing through centuries, without human intervention, without anyone knowing. The tree at the entrance to the megalithic tomb, perpetuating itself. The exact same genetic material standing in the exact same place for thousands of years. Not descended from the original tree. In a meaningful biological sense, the same tree. The continuity that mythology insisted upon, delivered through botany. The hawthorn trail food deserves a brief moment. Berries ground and mixed with suet, used by rural travelers in Britain as sustained energy for long journeys. The same principle as the North American pemmican, fat and fruit combined. The hedge at the field's edge providing in this use what the wilderness provided elsewhere. The boundary tree sustaining those who moved through the landscape, as it sustained famine communities, as it sustained armies obliquely through its impenetrable walls. The hawthorn at the edge of every journey, as it stands at the edge of every field. The clinical observation about hawthorn's pace of action is one I find particularly worth attending to. Hawthorn preparations work slowly, building effect over weeks, rather than producing an immediate response. This is reflected in how the traditional practitioners always described it. not a cure, a tonic. A plant that works with the body's own rhythm rather than overriding it. Modern clinical pharmacology has confirmed this. The measurable effects accumulate over time. You cannot take hawthorn once and expect the result. You take it consistently over weeks, and the body slowly responds. The boundary tree does not force anything. It stands at the edge and gradually shifts what is possible. The medicine working like the mythology, slowly, persistently, without urgency. The church found the hawthorn too deep in the culture to demonize, and so it redeemed it instead. The crown of thorns, the burning bush, the Glastonbury miracle, giving Christian explanations to a tree that was already too important to remove. The same blossom that smelled of sex and death associated with illicit May-Day practices. The same tree, simultaneously, providing the theological grounding for hawthorn's use in Christian protective ritual through the crown of thorns. The church holding both positions simultaneously, as everyone who has lived long with the hawthorn has been required to do. For an 18th century apothecary, the hawthorn arrived at his dispensary carrying 2,000 years of accumulated meaning. Roman goddess, fairy portal, Christian relic, witch's broomstick, bride's crown, vampire's bane, famine food, heart tonic. No other plant in the British pharmacopoeia carried so many contradictory lives simultaneously. The apothecary reached for the jar because a patient needed a cardiac tonic. He did not think about the strigers, or the AOS sign, or the crown of thorns. He thought about the dose and the preparation, but all of it was present in the jar, all of it in the dried berry, all of it in the tincture he measured out. The history does not disappear because the practitioner is not thinking about it. And that apothecary knew perhaps 1/10 of what the hawthorn was. He did not know about oligomeric procyanidins, about vitexin, about the ACE enzyme. He did not know that his tincture was simultaneously protecting his patient's liver and kidneys and brain while he prescribed it for the heart. He did not know about apomictic reproduction, about the 39% reduction in sudden cardiac death. He knew the berry worked. He knew to use it. He knew it had been used before him and would be used after. He knew what the hedge outside his window was, or thought he did. The hawthorn resists classification. I have been working with plants for 40 years. I have learned something about plants that resist classification. They are usually the most interesting ones, and usually the most useful. The plants that submit easily to a single description are often of limited range. The ones that cannot be pinned down are the ones that are doing many things at once. The hawthorn smells of death and of desire. It protects the living and guards the dead. It is a bride's crown and a vampire's bane, a fairy portal and a Christian relic, a famine food and a cardiac drug, a witch's broomstick and a child's hedgerow snap. The most British of trees and one of the most universal archetypes in the human imagination. It belongs entirely to neither one world nor the other. It has always stood at the edge, at the line between what is known and what is not, between the managed world and the wild one, between the living and the dead, between the sacred and the domestic, between the medicine chest and the mythology, the hedge-gorn, the thorn of the boundary. the name given to it in the deepest roots of the English language. Not name for what it does, name for where it stands and where it has always stood through everything we have traced tonight. At the edge, patient, thorned, white in May, waiting for whoever stops walking past long enough to look. And so we reach the end of our evening together. The fire has burned down to coals now. The shop is very quiet. We have come a long way tonight. From the Bronze Age hedgerow to the Belgrade vampire case. From the Greek god Hymen carrying his hawthorn torch to the 18th century apothecary who understood perhaps 1/10 of what was in his jar. From the May woods of Beltane to the ferry paths of rural Ireland and the car factory in Belfast that disturbed one. I hope you have found something worth carrying away from this evening. Perhaps a different way of seeing the hedge at the edge of a field. Perhaps simply a few hours of quiet. That too is worth something, particularly at this hour. If you are still awake, I suspect you are very nearly not. The hawthorn has a way of doing that. Working slowly, persistently, without urgency, without forcing anything, simply standing at the edge of wakefulness, patient and thorned, until sleep finds its way through. From this old shop, with its jars and its fire, and its 40 years of quiet work. Good night. Sleep. Well, the hawthorn is the boundary, as it always has been, watching over whatever crosses in the night.